Good morning, everyone. My name is Expectancy Map. It's my greatest privilege here at UConn to serve as the Executive Director of UConn's Global Health Symposium. It is with utmost pleasure that I welcome you to Winning the Birth Lottery, Globalization, and Health. Sitting here, bright and early on a misty Saturday morning, you might be wondering, why am I here? No, seriously. Well, let me make the case for why the cause of global health is not only worth your time, but also your engagement. Hopefully by the end of today, you'll have found this a worthy and ideally, in my wildest fantasy, a life-changing use of your Saturday. First, what is global health? It is easy to consider global health as the health of the other, the foreign, across seas and coded by languages we do not speak. It is easy to think of ourselves as separate from issues that plague communities abroad: malaria, tuberculosis, dengue fever. After all, as I speak, Yemen is currently experiencing the deadliest cholera outbreak in modern human history. India is shouldering over 1/3 of the world's cervical cancer burden. Conflict continues to ravage health systems across the world, from Venezuela to Ukraine, South Sudan to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Warring parties increasingly attack health facilities and healthcare workers, as well as vital infrastructure. Weakened by malnutrition and scarcity, more people in these places die of treatable and preventable diseases and chronic illnesses than of bullets and bombs. To address global health is to address the reality that for many, geography is destiny. When we think about these global epidemics, it is obvious that we have won the birth lottery by being born in this country, by sitting here in this air-conditioned auditorium on a Saturday morning, when we could have easily been born anywhere else, our circumstances drastically different. It is this idea of the birth lottery that we seek to explore today at UConn's second annual Global Health Symposium. How does the location of an individual's birth impact their access to care and life-sustaining factors? What are the political, socioeconomic, social, and environmental factors which impact global health? How do migration, resettlement, and globalization serve as social determinants of health? As the world and its economies become increasingly globalized, including extensive international travel and commerce, it is necessary to think about health in a global context. In this globalized world, people, their cultures, and their health are imported and exported, just like produce, petroleum products, pharmaceuticals, and plastics. More importantly, while disease is globalized, the underlying foundations of these health disparities are also. No longer do our decisions as a nation impact only our country and our people, or even just our immediate neighbors. On the contrary, as the leader of the free world, factors as small as American consumer desires to American foreign policy at large shape and determine several global health disparities and outcomes. You may be thinking, wow, that's a lot. I'm just a student. How am I supposed to even begin to work towards these problems that are so much bigger than myself? Well, global health has a place for all of us, whether we are aware of this or not. The issues impacting communities abroad and the US are intersectional in nature. This means the fight requires not only doctors and nurses, but also lawyers, engineers, teachers, artists, business people, and more. Our mission here at the UConn Global Health Symposium is to engage students in all of these fields while exposing them to global health problems that are consistently written off as too big to solve. When we acknowledge how inherently multidisciplinary global health is as a field, we can break down these problems that look seemingly hopeless and achieve the unthinkable. Together, we as educators, filmmakers, social scientists, writers, activists, and social entrepreneurs can achieve the unthinkable. Everyone is needed in the fight for global health. We believe students need the skills to not only think about these overarching health themes that transcend borders, but also gain the tools to recognize these same themes in their neighborhoods and surrounding communities. We hope to impart these skills in both reflection and in action, to you over the course of today through several engaging offerings that our team has worked for several months to prepare. In the morning portion of today's symposium, we will be presenting you with a thought-provoking keynote address, breakout sessions in global surgery, the intersection between the environment and health, and legal and humanitarian aid perspectives on refugee empowerment and advocacy, and a short premiere of a UConn student-directed documentary on the story of a Rwandan refugee, global health advocate, and nonprofit leader, Josiane Mumukunde Alex. At lunch, which will take place in the Student Union North and South lobbies, we will be featuring student research in global health, as well as a global health involvement fair for you to actively get involved on the issues that you'll be presented with today. Our afternoon session will be kicked off by a panel on reframing refugee health in light of modern politics and crises, featuring refugees and experts on refugee resettlement from our very own state. Finally, excitingly, we will be holding our live birth lottery simulation. Upon check-in and registration, you are given a brochure, and this includes our agenda and other information. The back of the brochure includes a lottery ticket, which you can scratch to reveal a lottery number, which will lead you to your simulation room. During breaks or reflection time, please take time to reflect on the questions that are listed inside the brochure and discuss them with your friends and neighbors. These questions will prime you for the thought experience you will have later today. Please take advantage of your peers and neighbors at the symposium. With around 200 students pre-registered ranging from 7 different undergraduate and graduate institutions throughout Connecticut and more from New England at large, the opportunities to meet those passionate about what you're passionate about are endless. There will be multiple opportunities for you to talk to them about the multimedia material presented to you today. For example, we have strategically placed critical thinking prompts in the break room, room 104, for you to take time to reflect, recharge, and attempt to answer these types of fundamental questions. Use these questions to fuel conversations, build a network of similarly driven peers, and inspire thought in new areas, leading to innovative research projects, novel initiatives, and lasting friendships. We urge you to please follow our Instagram at GLOSOC, G-L-O-H-S-O-C, and our Twitter at UConnGLOHS. And use the hashtag UConnBirthLottery and hashtag GLOHS 2019 throughout the day. We will be sure to feature your posts on our page. We hope to equip you today with the skills to make a tangible impact in the field of global health, starting now, as an advocate and as a student, and to help you understand why your presence here in this room is so vital to building a stronger, healthier, and more connected world. The people in this room are the future, and the future of global health begins now. UConn GLOSOC proudly presents the 2nd Annual Global Health Symposium, Winning the Birth Lottery. On that note, it is my great pleasure to introduce our Saturday keynote speaker, Professor Sarah S. Willen. Sarah S. Willen is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut and Director of the Research Program on Global Health and Human Rights at the university's Human Rights Institute. A former NIMH postdoctoral fellow in global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School, she holds a PhD in anthropology and MPH in global health, both from Emory University. She's a 2-time recipient of the Rudolf Virchow Prize from the Critical Anthropology of Global Health Caucus of the Society for Medical Anthropology. Dr. Willen has authored over 35 articles and book chapters on issues of migration and health, health and human rights, social justice mobilization, medical education, and other topics, including recent pieces in The Lancet, Medical Anthropology, and Social Science and Medicine. She's editor or co-editor of 3 books and 4 special journal issues, as well as a 5th in progress. Her book, Fighting for Dignity, Migrant Lives at Israel's Margins, is forthcoming in June 2019 from the University of Pennsylvania Press. Her work has received support from the National Science Foundation, Fulbright Hays, and the Social Science Research Council, as well as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and other sources. Dr. Willen is currently Principal Investigator of ARCHES, the Americans' Conceptions of Health Equity Study, an interdisciplinary mixed method study of how people in the United States think about health, fairness, and social interconnectedness, funded by the RWJ Foundation. Please give a warm welcome and round of applause to Professor Sarah S. Willen.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Akshaya, for that lovely introduction. And thank you you to all of you for waking up early and coming here to think together today. I want to just begin by taking a moment to say that the committee that's organized this weekend's event has been extraordinary. They've been working extraordinarily hard, and I know that last night went marvelously, and there's a tremendous amount of excitement and a tremendous amount of provocative thinking in store for all of us today. So I want to, let's see, I'm gonna get my slides up here and get them going. So I'm not sure how much sense this title makes to you right now, but by the time I'm done, I think it will. So the title for my presentation this morning is Redlining Red Seeds: How History, Power, and Politics Rig the Birth Lottery in the US and around the globe. Now, let's see if I can get my slides moving. There we go. So the idea of a lottery implies randomness, right? But we know that there's nothing random about who's born into those circumstances that will help them flourish and thrive, and who's born into circumstances that will break them down and impede their ability to flourish, right? And this is true around the globe. And a lot of today's conversation will focus around issues outside of the country in which we live. But of course, it's also true here in the US as well. And I know everyone received a lottery ticket this morning when we arrived, and the organizers of our symposium have created an interesting and provocative challenge to our sense of who we are in this world, how we got to be doing what it is we're doing today, and what we believe we deserve as a function of the circumstances into which we were born. And I know that conversation will be saved for later, but I want to get us thinking about some of these themes now. Now, of course, this thought experiment that will play out in the conversations this afternoon isn't being conducted with a random sample, right? If you're in this room, whether you have $1 million in the bank or a boatload of student debt, right, you've already won, right? We've already won in some pretty fundamental ways. And I say this with a pretty high level of confidence. You probably slept last night in a safe building. No rats, no cockroaches, no mold invading your lungs as you slept. When you woke up this morning and went to brush your teeth, I'll bet you knew there would be water when you turned on that tap, and that it would be clean and safe and drinkable. And if you didn't eat this morning, I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume it's because you were running late, or because you chose not to, not because healthy and nutritious food was out of reach. So in other words, those of us in this room probably all have pretty consistent and reliable access to what we tend to call the social determinants of health. And I imagine that's a term familiar to many of you in this room, but I like to give it a little tweak and specify that what we're really talking about are the social determinants of good health, right? This way of thinking about health, according to this model that you see here, in terms of the larger factors that influence any given person's likelihood of being healthy and flourishing, or of getting sick, dying young, this way of thinking about health is radically different from the model of health that we tend to use in the United States. A model that medical anthropologists like myself and many of you in this room, because I know we have lots of students in medical anthropology in this room, that alternative model we tend to call the biomedical model, right? And according to the biomedical model, health is really fundamentally our responsibility in a lot of respects. You can throw a little genetics in, right? But largely it's a function of our choices, right? And our behaviors. In the biomedical model, we tend to think of our bodies as machines, right? Machines that can break, machines that can be fixed. And of course we know who those technicians are, right? Doctors. Doctors come fix our broken bodies. But when we look at the social determinants of health model that we use in anthropology, and in public health, and in global health, of course, individual level matters factor, for sure. But they're just one piece of this much larger puzzle, right? All of those broader factors, everything in the yellow band, and the green band, and the purple band, all that stuff turns out to be just as important. And let me go further. It's not even that it's just as important, it's more important, much more important. So one way to put this is to say that the social and structural circumstances of our lives can quite literally become embodied. I once wrote about it this way. I said embodiment refers to the complex, multi-level processes through which human bodies literally incorporate aspects of our environment, social, political, biological, in ways that can be read on our biology, much like the skeletal remains of people long dead. So, as I've suggested, and as I'll say more in my talk, let's see, we could home in on one social determinant. Let's talk a little bit about housing for a moment. It's pretty fundamental. So, at the individual level, we want to live in a home where we have reliable access to utilities, right? A home that's free of physical hazards like electrical problems or structural problems. We probably want to live in a home that's free of insects, not just because they transmit disease, but also because they're gross and they're scary, right? I have kids. I don't want to have my kids living in a house with rats, right? We want to live in a house that's free of environmental toxins, things that can get into our body and cause illness. But housing is not just about the unit we live in, it's also about the larger community or environment in which our home is located, right? We want to live in a place that has access to transportation, that has access to our basic needs, where we can go to the grocery store and get the food we need, where there are green spaces to play. This might sound like a kind of fluffy thing, parks, but they're really not. They're fundamental to our ability to be healthy. And look at that bottom one. If you're afraid to walk outside because of flying bullets, or because you're afraid of violence, that's going to affect your ability to be healthy, right? In some pretty deep ways, some pretty fundamental ways. Now, in the United States, our access to housing that meets these needs, as everyone in this room knows, is almost inevitably influenced by our racial background and by the racial history of our country. It's almost inevitably influenced by whether our parents, or more likely our grandparents or our great-grandparents, were blocked in their efforts to obtain housing by policies that we can describe as redlining. Now, if you're not familiar with the term redlining, and I imagine most folks are, I want to give a definition. So this is from a Washington Post article that appeared just about a year ago, and a long article about redlining and its continuing impact on health in the US. So in the 1930s, this is where we're starting. There are older histories of housing segregation, but in the 1930s, government surveyors graded neighborhoods in cities across the country. The blue marked the ones that were desirable, places where it would be pretty easy to get a loan, where banks were excited to give loans, right? Yellow were definitely declining, and the red were hazardous, right? And those were the ones that local lenders discounted as credit risks, in large part because of race, right? Because of changing race and ethnic demographics. And they also took into account other things. So this is a map of Cleveland, and I'll come back to Cleveland. But the basic gist here is the way in which banks managed their decisions about who to give money to were influenced fundamentally by race. And let's call it what it is, by racism, right? So let's take a look at some other maps. I just pulled out a few, 239 cities, lots of maps, right? Here's a map of Atlanta, a city I care about very much. I went to graduate school there, lived there for 8 years. Here's a map of Hartford, right? Not too far from home. Sorry, it's crooked. This is what UConn researchers posted on the website, and I couldn't straighten it out. So take a look. There are areas in which if you wanted to get a loan, you simply couldn't because the banks wouldn't write a loan. Now, this shows both Hartford and West Hartford. If you wanted to live in one of those areas further from the city, further from the river, where housing was more expensive, you could get a loan, sure. And I'm going to tell you something. I live in West Hartford. So right now, I benefit from a history of racialized housing policies that continue to affect our country to this day. Now, if you're interested in going deep into these histories of redlining and the ways in which they came to be and their impact on our country, I would strongly recommend you take a look at this book. Anyone already read this book? Know this book, The Color of Law by Rothstein? No hands up. All right, you guys gotta check out this book. It should be like the UConn Reads book for next year. It's extraordinary. In this book, Richard Rothstein basically shows how housing segregation wasn't an accident. It was a matter of federal policy. And here's how he lays it out at the very beginning of the book. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local government, all those levels of government, defined where whites and African Americans should live. And it had implications for other groups too, but this is sort of the big picture. The policy was so systematic and forceful that its effects endure to the present time. And here's where we get to the gist of it. Without our government's purposeful imposition of racial segregation, the other causes like private prejudice, white flight, real estate steering, when real estate agents say, oh, you don't want to live in that neighborhood, you want to live in this neighborhood, right? Bank redlining, income differences, and self-segregation would have existed, but with far less opportunity for expression. This is the history of our country, and this book really is a must-read for anyone who really wants to understand the history of housing segregation in the United States. So I want to home in on this sentence in the middle, on those enduring effects, because it's come to influence some of the work that I'm doing now that I want to tell you about today. So, when it comes to health, this statement could not possibly be more true. And I want to tell you a little bit in my presentation this morning about how researchers and citizen activists like me, and also other people, clinicians, public health professionals, policymakers, attorneys, journalists, filmmakers, nurses, what all those things you guys are going to be as your careers unfold can do to understand problems like this, maybe this specific problem in the United States, or maybe similar problems around the world, and take action, okay? So to do this, I want to take you on a little bit of a journey through some of the opportunities that I've had in my own career so far to think about the non-randomness of this birth lottery, and about how our chances in life are patterned by history, and by power, and politics, and racialization, among other factors, and how all those factors come quite literally to be embodied, right? So I want to invite you to think with me about the scientific, and also the moral or ethical questions that we can ask and that we should ask when we see pathogenic patterns, or patterns that harm the health and the lives of individuals and communities. Now I want to repeat something I just said because it's super important. I said that these are questions of value. And I want to talk a little bit about why values matter for all of this, okay? In two senses, and not simple or flat-footed senses. I want us to really develop two critical ways of thinking about values. The first one is kind of the easy one, relatively speaking. What are our values? When we're being really honest with ourselves, whose health matters to us? Personally, and as members of broader communities, and why? How have our ideas on these topics changed about whose health matters and whose lives matter? What catalyzed those changes? Maybe it was a course we took, maybe it was a lecture we attended, or a trip we went on, or maybe a visit to a community that's really different from our own. Maybe it was a story we heard, or maybe it was a religious teaching. Or maybe it came from a more visceral place, from an experience, a personal experience of not getting what we needed, not getting what we felt like we deserve. So this brings us to the second way I want us to think this morning about values and their relationship to public health and global health. That first question is really a kind of personal question and a philosophical question. The second is really an anthropological question. It's a question we can study systematically using qualitative research methods like interviews and participant observation, as well as quantitative methods like surveys. And in fact, this question and this toolkit of methods that I'm describing are one of the things that keep me busiest these days, so I'll say more about that in a moment. But first I want to talk a little bit about a kind of bigger theme we can pull out of these questions. So, when we're thinking about decision makers, and decision makers could be elected officials, it could be teachers, it could be people in positions of corporate power, it could be us in our capacities as voters, right? So when we're thinking about people acting in public spaces and public relationships, we can ask not just, what are people's values and where do they come from and how might they change, but we can also look at how they vary, right? Why do these groups value these people or hold these perspectives, and those other groups take a different stance. And then what happens when you see clashing values? Another question we can study anthropologically or sociologically using the qualitative and quantitative methods that I've described. So in my work, I think about this whole cluster of issues in terms of one key theme, and that's the theme of deservingness. Not in the sense of just in the sense of that first set of values, of me asserting what I value and who I think is deserving, but really in the second anthropological sense of saying, how can we understand who holds which values and why? Right? That's something we can study as social scientists. So let me take you through a little bit of how I think about this question. So this is really the core question when we're thinking about this theme of deservingness. How do different people respond to this question of who deserves what and why in the health domain? And when I'm thinking about this question, I'm usually thinking about health. I'm a medical anthropologist. I tend to care most about health. So let me flesh out why this even matters in the first place, because I think we have to make the case. Why should we be thinking of, there's so many things we could be thinking about. Why bother focusing our attention on looking systematically at the values of different groups? Well, think about it this way. Questions of who deserves what are everywhere. We just don't talk about them, right? Questions of who deserves what are pivotal, if implicit, in the political process. They shape the discourse and the policies of our legislators and our policymakers, of our healthcare institutions, of clinicians, of the media, and of ordinary people like you and me. We all know this, right? But you probably haven't thought about it in this way, because this is the stuff that's in the background, right? This is the implicit stuff. And what I'm trying to do is to take that implicit stuff and put it out in front of us so we can say, let's look historically at where these values came from. Let's understand why they clash and how they clash. And when people debate about the deservingness of a particular group, it's not usually about evidence. That's the crazy thing about this. It's about people's gut. It's about these visceral senses of what they care about. That's why it's so important to be able to check our own values and really think critically about them as we're trying to understand the values of others. So here are some questions that my colleagues and I study when we engage this topic. We try and look systematically at questions like, okay, so whose health is getting attention? Why are we focusing on this population and not that population? Why are we focusing on people in these countries and not those countries? Why are we focusing on these diseases and not those diseases? Or these health conditions and not those health conditions? We look at that connection between individual values and experiences and the public positions that people take. And we're interested in why people change, because we all do, we all can, right? We're not born with a set of views and values that we hold to our entire lives. If that were the case, we wouldn't be here this morning, right? Thinking together, thinking critically together, broadening our own horizons, right? We can change, and that's something that we can study systematically. So I want to tell you a little bit about, you're probably wondering, okay, so this is pretty broad and abstract, and here's this project based in the United States. How does this sort of fit into a broader global health context? Well, I want to share a little bit about the work that I've done globally that links up with and has really brought me to the kinds of work that I'm going to share with you today from my activities in the United States. So my first major project, starting when I was a graduate student, focused on issues of unauthorized migration. I spent about 3 years living in South Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is the largest city in Israel. Israel is a very complicated place. If you read the newspaper, you absolutely know that. So I spent 3 years living in a poor area of a very complicated country, hanging out with migrants. Migrants who had come to Israel looking for the same kinds of opportunities that people look for when they come from Mexico to the United States, or Jamaica to the United States, or Turkey to Germany, right? So I was hanging out with people whose migration circumstances were pretty similar to a lot of migrants around the world, but the particular country they were arriving in was really different in a lot of ways. And these are a couple of images from the clinic where I did a lot of my field work, a clinic run by a human rights organization called Physicians for Human Rights Israel. And so I spent that time working with two groups of people, unauthorized migrants, mostly from Ghana, Nigeria, and the Philippines, and Israeli migrant advocates and activists. And this work is not the focus of my talk today, but I wanted to just sort of put it on the map, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it. But let me just give you a little flavor of where I was. This is the central bus station in South Tel Aviv. This is, the heart of the community I was living in. And I want to share a couple of images from a community gathering at the Catholic Church in Tel Aviv, where you can see just how diverse this community of migrant workers became. Migrant workers only started coming to Israel in 1993, which is very recent. And between 1993 and 2000, the number of migrant workers jumped from just a couple thousand to close to 300,000. Huge transformation in a small country in a very short period of time. And I got to do lots of things like go to church with people, be part of their community activities, but the real focus was people's experiences of health and illness. So for these marginalized folks, what did they do when they got sick? Where did they go? The short answer is there weren't very many places for them to go. There was the clinic I just showed you, that little storefront clinic which had very few resources and was completely volunteer run. So I did stuff like hang out with folks while they were pregnant. Most of my work focused on experiences of pregnancy and reproduction. I got to know some amazing families. I got to do some crazy stuff like be a bridesmaid in some of their weddings. And the culmination of that work is a book that's coming out this June called Fighting for Dignity, Migrant Lives at Israel's Margins. And I actually had a slide of the cover, but it's not 120% official, so I cut it because I'm superstitious. I'm waiting for the final approval. But if you're interested in learning more, you can send me an email and I'll put you on the mailing list so you know when the book is out. And so I can send you a discount code. So that's the work that I did before deciding it was time to do some work in my own country, a country where I've lived for most of my life. And I want to take you to the place where I've been doing this new project. It's a place that's very different from Tel Aviv. And it's a place where I've spent a lot of time and that I care about very deeply, and that's Cleveland, Ohio. So has anyone here been to Cleveland? Couple of hands. Anyone here from Cleveland? All right, no Clevelanders. That's cool. That's fine. So here is the map that I showed you earlier. This is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC map, that was drawn up in 1940 to say where banks ought to grant loans and where they shouldn't grant loans. And I want to take you a little deeper into that story and its implications, the ways in which this social determinant of housing has come to influence the health of Clevelanders today, and what folks are doing to try and address some of the resulting disparities. So the project that I'm going to talk about is called ARCHES, or the Americans' Conceptions of Health Equity Study. And our goal overall is to use an interdisciplinary set of research methods to dive into some of those questions that I was raising, questions about the impact of values on policy, especially in the health domain, and also about how people from really different backgrounds think about this big picture question of whose health matters and whose lives matter. And also about the question of how views can change, right? Which is another huge question. So let me tell you a little bit about the study. And part of what I want to do in walking you through this is to give you a model of what you can do with research tools. Some of you will go on to be researchers, some of you will not. But let me show you a little bit of what some of the research methods that you're probably learning about in some of your courses can do. So I said this is a mixed method study. So we have a qualitative phase and a quantitative phase. In the qualitative phase, we've been using the core research methods of my own field of anthropology. Interviews, which are semi-structured, and we've been conducting qualitative interviews along with an iPad survey. So we're getting some qualitative and some quantitative data. And we've so far interviewed 164 people, 164 conversations with 164 individuals. I'll tell you a little bit about them in a minute. And we're also conducting what anthropologists call participant observation. Another name for that is hanging out over a long period of time. With a community-wide health equity initiative. that's looking at the history of redlining in Cleveland, that's looking at the health effects, and that's trying to make a difference. The second phase of our study, and we're right at the hinge point between the two, is that we're taking all of our qualitative findings and using them to develop a survey that we're going to field with a nationally representative sample in the second phase. And I'm working with a political scientist to do that. So that's gonna happen in the fall. Now, you can't do work like this alone, and you might have noticed that I'm white, and I'm working in a city that's pretty diverse, and that's important too. So we put together an advisory board of folks from a wide variety of backgrounds, both academic backgrounds and professional backgrounds, to help us get a handle on what this local initiative is doing, how we can think about these big questions, and what we can do with our findings. So we've got folks from community development, from philanthropy, in public housing, higher education, law, public health, and also clinical medicine, all working together as an advisory board. So the initiative that I mentioned is called the Health Improvement Partnership Cuyahoga. Cuyahoga is the county in which Cleveland is located, and it's pretty amazing. In a couple of years, they've brought together more than 600 people and more than 100 organizations to look at history and look at its continuing impact on the health of Clevelanders. And I have a little 2-minute video about it that I could show or I could save for the Q&A. Show it? You guys want to see 2-minute video? Okay, let's go ahead. So this is how they represent themselves publicly. Whoops, where'd it go? It was here. Tab was closed, sorry.
We are building opportunities for everyone to have a fair chance to be healthy. Why? Isn't it up to each of us to make our own healthy choices? Not exactly. The choices we make are shaped by the choices we have. Our communities were not created equal, and some people are born and live in places where it is difficult to grow healthy. Historically, policy decisions like redlining limited mortgages in communities of color while creating low-interest government-backed loans for others to move to the suburbs. The result? Some neighborhoods became more vibrant and healthier while others were left out. These policy decisions affect everyone's choices for good health. They provide benefits to some while burdening others. Depending on where you live, you may or may not have access to an assortment of fresh and healthy food, or you may or may not have safe and affordable housing. Even today, some parts of Cuyahoga County are divided by income, skin color, and ethnicity, and the same neighborhoods that were redlined in the past are now the areas with the poorest health. We all pay for poor health. Poor health for some makes healthcare cost more for everyone. We believe that all people should have the right to a healthy life, that race and place matter for health, and that values shape decisions. Together, we can take action to influence future decisions. HIP Cuyahoga is working with neighbors, groups, organizations, and policymakers to transform the communities of Cuyahoga County into healthier places to live, learn, work, and play. We all play a role. Go visit hipcuyahoga.org and click Get Involved.
So that's a quick overview of HIP Cuyahoga for public audiences like us. And we could talk a lot about it. We could talk about the video. We could talk about the story it's telling. We could talk about it as a marketing tool for public health. And we can maybe come to some of those questions in the Q&A. But what I want to focus on right now is a core value at the heart of this initiative. I was talking earlier about how our values can change, about how we can learn things that change our views on whose health matters. So at the root of HIP Cuyahoga is this idea of what they call perspective transformation. And here's what they try to do. They say we engage leaders and community members to use both the head and the heart to see and understand the world in new ways and to help eliminate structural racism as a root cause of health inequity. This initiative is spearheaded by the county health department, and they're talking about structural racism. I'm going to think about that for a minute. That's pretty extraordinary. It's a pretty amazing thing for a health department in the Midwest to be doing. And I want to loop back in a minute to this point to show you that it can have some pretty astonishing effects. First, just quickly, here's who we've talked to. You probably wonder, all right, who are those 170 people? So we've talked to folks who are CEOs and mayors and media leaders. We've talked to grassroots community leaders and church clergy. We've talked to folks in public health. We've talked to clinicians and lots of community members. And so this is roughly who we've been talking to and interviewing in our survey. And those of you who, you might not have as much to say about this as I do. When I look at this map of the county, my heart just it bubbles over. Because when you look at this, you see that we've really been talking to folks all over the place, not just in one community. Last year we did a lot of traveling around, finding people of very different backgrounds, political leanings, ages, socioeconomic statuses, racial and ethnic backgrounds, disability statuses. So we're really proud of the sample of 164 people we've talked to so far. But let me give you just a little bit more of a view of Cleveland. And this is where I want to kind of get to the heart of my message today, and then where I'm going to leave you. And I'm going to move around. I was told I could grab one of these. So here we are. Okay, so if you forgot where Cleveland is, it's in Ohio. It's a city, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great, okay, so it's a city that has quite a lot to be proud of. It's had a good amount of resurgence in the past 20, 25 years, revitalization of the downtown area. It has the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's a beautiful city, it's an old city. It's also a city with a lot of problems. Anyone know who this is? Anyone recognize this face? This is Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old boy who was playing with a toy gun in a park in Cleveland. And someone called the police, and the police came, and within an instant, he was shot and killed because he was suspected of being a criminal trying to hurt other people. Tamir's death has been and continues to be a sore and festering wound in the city, especially for the city's communities of color. The officers who were charged in his death were not convicted. This continues to be a major issue in how Clevelanders think about the relationship between those who police them and those who live in the city. Any serial podcast listeners in the room? Couple? So if you listen to the Serial podcast, you know that the third season, this year's season, focused on Cleveland. In particular, focused on the justice system in Cleveland, Ohio. And that Serial series also showed many of the really profound challenges that the city deals with in terms of legacies of racism and classism, in terms of infrastructure that doesn't do its job, in terms of policing that doesn't honor the lives or the dignity of the people who are being policed. So Cleveland is, as beautiful as it is, as much as it's grown and changed, as proud as I am of it, it's a city that's struggling with quite a lot. Now let me take you into the health direction. You may have seen maps like this before. This is a life expectancy map showing the gaps in life expectancy across areas of a given city. In this case, it's Cleveland. If you take a look, let's see if I can make this work. Over here, in the downtown area, the downtown neighborhood of St. Clair Superior, the life expectancy is 70. If you look over here out in the suburbs, there's a life expectancy of 82 years. That's a 12-year gap. That's the difference between knowing your grandchildren or not, right? That's a huge gap. Now here's another way of looking at that map, and I want to give you another little way to think about it. So over here in that downtown area, I'm actually moving over to Glenville. That's where my parents were born and grew up. Over there, just east of the highway, out in the suburbs, that's where I grew up. So this gap in life expectancy is racialized for reasons that I've begun to talk about, and it's also the story of my family's life. And I want to take you into one key episode in history that you're probably familiar with, but if not, I want to make sure. Who's heard of the GI Bill? All right, most of us in this room. So the GI Bill, in a nutshell, was a legal provision signed by Roosevelt, who basically said if you served in the military, you should be granted certain benefits that will allow you to establish yourself and build your life moving forward. So this was World War II veterans coming home, granted access to higher education, and granted access to certain kinds of lending opportunities that would make it possible to buy a house in the rapidly growing suburbs. Both of my grandfathers served in World War II, and one of them came home, went to university, after growing up in this area over here. He was able, with GI Bill benefits, to go to college, then go to dental school, become a dentist, and move progressively east. My parents had the same kinds of benefits. They were able to go to university and move progressively east. And then I was born over here. I benefited in ways that I was never aware of as a child from the GI Bill and its unfolding impact on housing policies, on access to higher education, on access to social mobility. This is what I deal with. This is what I live with. This is my reality. So for me, as an anthropologist, as a researcher, when I look at these data, those questions of values are always in my mind. If you want to read a really provocative take on what this has meant for African Americans who were denied those benefits, and that's a fundamental piece that we have to keep in mind, you might want to take a look at Ta-Nehisi Coates' Case for Reparations, which is an article that really, many of you might have read it, but it really makes the case that the fact that people like me are able to move forward in their lives the way that I've been able to because of those benefits, and the children and grandchildren of African Americans who served in our military and didn't get those benefits, that we have to look at those with a very critical eye and think about what we as a society should be doing about it. So let me take you from these big picture questions and these gaps in life expectancy across geography into health statistics. On our left, we see stats for the county, in the middle, we see stats for the city of Cleveland, and on the right, we see our national benchmark. When we think about that Hulk map, right, and we think about the way in which it set certain people on a path to move into those more privileged areas and advance in their lives through social classes to gain wealth, and we think about those people who were not able to make those transitions, we see that there's a clustering of negative health consequences for those who couldn't move. So when we look in the city, we see that we have a really, really serious problem with infant mortality. This isn't Bangladesh, this is Cleveland, Ohio, 13.2 per 1,000 live births. We have a serious problem with people not getting prenatal care. Here's how we can look at, now this next set of maps I'm gonna show you overlays health statistics on the whole map. So take a look at this, and I'm gonna go kind of quickly, but the point is the redundancy, right? Okay, got the whole map with the colors in the background. Infant mortality, diabetes, exposure to lead poisoning can cause problems with the kidney and the heart and the brains and the lungs, cognitive development, behavioral issues, learning disabilities. Lead map overlays onto the whole map. How about some other stuff? High cost mortgages, incarceration rates. And here we go. This is the way in which the city has become racialized. The populations that are dealing the most concentrated way with this clustering of health effects, clustering of disadvantages that I've been talking about, are people of color in the city of Cleveland. So, you can kind of read that. So here we are at my title, Redlining and Red Seeds. I want to share with you a quotation from one of the people we interviewed. This is a public health professional who's affiliated with HIP Cuyahoga, the health equity initiative that I mentioned earlier. And here's what he said to me in an interview last spring. He's a scientist, okay? He says, look, I'm really data-driven and analytic. When I started at the health department 18 years ago, I was working on maternal and child indicators. We did some GIS-based work, right? So if you're familiar with GIS, it didn't matter what indicator I was looking at. The same communities had the worst outcomes. And I called it back then the Red Sea, because we used red in our maps to indicate the worst outcomes. Like, man, this Red Sea just stays here. And then you learn the story of redlining. And like, wow, this makes sense. It started to, kind of illuminate the root cause for why I was seeing the things that I was seeing in my data. So here we see an experience of education, learning about history that transforms values for a scientist. Pretty interesting. And he says, of course, as epidemiologists, you're supposed to believe that nothing is due to chance. There's always a reason. You don't necessarily always know the reason, or you can't elucidate it right at a given moment. But it's all starting to make sense to me, right? Here we are. Now I have a better understanding of why the Red Sea never moves. It always sits there. It was designed that way. And now he's speaking of his work with Hip Cuyahoga, now you have an opportunity to make a difference. How long is it going to take? I don't know. I mean, my public health career could be over by the time we really get it, by the time we really get at this better place. But now I have a sense of hope. And what I find so striking about this interview, and it's really stuck with me, I think about this gentleman and I think about our conversation a lot. It says to me, whether we're scientists or policymakers or teachers or journalists, when we learn new stuff, it changes what we think matters. And when our sense of what matters changes, then we can begin to take action. Specific kinds of action, using the tools available to us, using the skills that we have over the course of our lifetimes. So let me just offer in conclusion one other concept that I've been developing in my own work as an anthropologist. I talked a bunch about deservingness and how I've been kind of theorizing that. Here's another one that I've called idioms of social justice mobilization. What's an idiom? You could think of the Spanish word idioma. It's like a language, right? An idiom is a short, tight expression that does a lot of conceptual work. So if we think about idioms of social justice mobilization, we're here today to think about one of them, global health. But it's not the only one, right? There are others. And in a piece that I published with some colleagues a couple years ago, this is how we talked about what's at stake when we were thinking about social justice mobilization for health, when we're talking about taking our values and putting them in the service of larger health-related goals. So if we think about social justice mobilization for health, we're talking about social determinants, right? Recognizing that upstream factors can cause grave harm to the health of individuals as well as populations. It's about recognizing that those factors affect different populations more than others, and some populations are much more vulnerable than others for reasons we need to understand, and that those vulnerable people and populations also need attention and care. It's about a recognition that if you really want to move on all of this stuff, you don't just tell people to change their behavior, right? You look upstream. You look to those structural and social factors that matter. And it means recognizing that there have to be partnerships, there has to be coordination, right? There has to be conversation, dialogue, and true, genuine, authentic engagement among people in clinical positions, in public health positions, in policy, in civil society, and other key stakeholders, not just in the health domains, but far beyond them as well. If you really want to move on global health, if you really want to move on health inequities, these are the kinds of things you want to have in mind. So like I said, we're here today under the umbrella of global health. But maybe you're here today because what you really care about is health inequity in a broader sense. Maybe you don't want to work globally. Maybe you think it sounds exciting and interesting, but you don't think it's going to work with your life. What I want to encourage you to do is to think about all of the other idioms out there to move on these issues, to really clarify your values and turn them into action. Here's a list of some of the scholarly idioms, right? You can study medical anthropology, or social medicine, or social epidemiology. You can think in terms of medical humanitarianism, or human rights, or others. You could really hone in on an action-oriented idiom. Maybe you're not a researcher, you're not interested in research, that's not what you see in the future, but you want to be a practicing nurse, you want to be a pharmacist, you want to be an attorney, or a journalist. Find your idiom And that's really my final point and my take home for you today. Maybe global health is your future, or maybe it's the next stage of your life. Life is long. We forget this as college students. We think we make a commitment and that's what we do until we die. Life has stages, right? So whether the next stage of your life or your entire career is going to be about global health, about clarifying your values and understanding how to translate them into practice, or whether it's going to involve one of these other idioms, I really want to encourage you to think about the ways in which our values do matter as individuals, as voters, as parts of a larger society. So I hope that this has offered a couple of ideas and thoughts and reflections that can help you chart your own path, and I really thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of my own path with you today. Thanks so much.
So we're gonna have the Q&A now. We thought it would be fun and quirky to have this like catch box. So like we're gonna throw the mic out. If you have any questions, so does anyone? We're gonna open the floor to questions now. Does anyone have a first question for Dr. Willen? All right, are you ready? Get some exercise in the morning. This is why I'm not in the women's basketball team for many reasons.
So when you were in undergraduate education, what was your kind of path that led you to become interested in anthropology, and specifically medical anthropology?
That's a fantastic question. And the answer is very clear. I took a gender studies course as a sophomore, and then I had an opportunity to take a graduate seminar as a junior, focusing on maternal and reproductive health. I decided I wanted to do a gender studies minor, and that took me into a course focusing on health with a bunch of more advanced students, and it was a global health course, looking at the ways in which women in many parts of the world don't have access to prenatal care, the ways in which rates of infant mortality and also maternal mortality are astonishingly and terrifyingly high. And that sparked something for me. I decided when I was 19 that I was going to be a medical anthropologist. It took me a lot of time to figure out everything else in my life, but that I knew when I was 19 years old. And I could take you into a little bit of detail or a lot, but just because you're all at a place where you're thinking through your own paths, I'll give you a tiny bit more detail. I thought, okay, medical anthropology, I have to do a PhD in that, but I also want to be a clinician. So I'm going to study midwifery, and I'm going to be a midwife and an anthropologist, and that'll be awesome. That'll cover all my bases. And then I said, hang on, maybe I want to actually go into medicine, because that would be really powerful to have an MD and a PhD in anthropology. And I went to graduate school thinking that that would be my path. And I got into graduate school, got my project up and running. I was doing my research in Tel Aviv, hanging out in the clinic I showed you, getting to know women, talking to them about their reproductive experiences, and trying to go to another city to take OChem, because I hadn't taken OChem as an undergrad. And I realized that was going to be kind of hard to try and really commit to the ethnographic work that I was doing, and also take OChem and physics and fill in those gaps and then apply to medical school. So I said, all right, I'm going to put that post-bac stuff on hold and really focus on doing anthropology well. And I did. And at a certain point, I realized I didn't really need the clinical degree. It wasn't something that was going to be crucial for what I wanted to do. I had an opportunity to do a master's in public health, which I will say has been phenomenal. If anyone here is interested in public health, it's an extraordinary field. It's so diverse, so broad, kind of like anthropology. You can do so many things with it. And as an anthropologist, having that additional training in public health has afforded some really exciting opportunities, like being taken seriously by clinicians. So it's not vital, but it's been really wonderful. And it all started when I took a gender studies class focusing on maternal and reproductive health at age 19 in Cleveland, Ohio.
Anyone have any other questions? I'm just gonna pass this.
So, there's a microphone in here. Sorry if this sounds a little bit ignorant on my part, but How would you say you felt like about your safety when you were in Tel Aviv? Like, did you feel like it was a concern at all?
I couldn't hear about safety.
Yeah.
It was really scary. There were suicide bombings every once in a while. I have a chapter in my book about a suicide bombing that took place when I was volunteering at the clinic. And I had to be the person to tell everyone in the waiting room that there had been a bombing. Wherever we live, wherever we work, we are part of that reality. So if you decide to work in a country that has really poor access to water, that's going to affect you too. If you decide to live in an area that is politically unstable, that's going to affect you too. And so as we decide what we want to do with our lives, we have to keep in mind that when we come in as researchers, or we come in as volunteers, or we come in as trainees, we won't live in a bubble. We'll be part of the place where we are, right? And so for me, that meant that there were suicide bombings on the bus routes that I took to work. Not too many, though, fortunately.
And then we'll have one final question before we break out for our sessions. Just gonna
Throw it from here.
Do you think I can do it?
Yes.
Proud of myself.
Hi. So how do you think educational reform in the younger generations, probably beginning in middle school, can be adjusted or modified to help them understand this issue and better help when they're older?
So which issue in particular? The issue of redlining in specific, or?
Yeah, more or less in general, to see how their actions can play out, because ultimately it is the individual actions that we choose.
Yeah.
And our environment, so how they can better understand how their environment is already affecting them at such a young age.
So that's a great question, and I will say, as part of the Arches project, and I didn't show this, but we were funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the largest health research foundation in the country, and we promised to do a lot of things. We promised to share what we're learning in a lot of different ways. One of the things that we're planning to do is a teaching module. So, this is a long list, but we're thinking very seriously. We were thinking that it would be for university students or even graduate students, but now we've been thinking more about having something that would actually be for high school students, that would take two pieces and put them together in a way that would provoke discussion among kids. First, the story of redlining and structural racism and the ways in which social determinants of poor health are part of people's lives just as much as social determinants of good health are an unreflective part, right? So I didn't think about, growing up, I didn't think about the fact that I lived in a safe house that had clean running water and that we had really nice parks. I didn't think about any of that. We need to get people who have access to the social determinants of good health thinking critically about why. And then we need to find ways for people who are not experiencing that same kind of privilege and advantage to get the narrative, the vocabulary, the lexicon for explaining why their communities have come to be the way they are. So that's a first piece, having the language to talk about structural inequities in our society. The other piece, and this is really at the heart of Arches, and I didn't talk about it too much, the most interesting and in some ways the most challenging interviews that we've done have been with people who, I'll just be blunt, people who are politically conservative and have a very different view of everything I've talked about today than our team, for the most part, has. So we're researchers and we're scientists and we're using the tools of scholarly inquiry to try and get a handle on a very broad range of views, but we have our own views too, and we have to, so when I've been sitting with people who talk with great enthusiasm about the current administration, and when they talk with great antipathy about all of the damage done to our country by the previous administration, and how Obama sowed divisiveness, and how he created racial problems in our country, it's really hard for me personally to listen to. But unless we're able to understand the perspectives of people who come from very different positions than we do, it's going to be really hard to create conversation. So when we think about the teaching module we want to put together for students, we think about providing a language for talking about and understanding structural inequity, and we want to also provide opportunities for people to encounter folks who see the world very differently, either face-to-face, which can be very difficult to arrange, or through narratives and through text.
because you're absolutely right that to start talking to college students is kind of late. We need to talk to people who are much younger and give them some tools and concepts that can allow them to deepen their understanding of why the world is the way it is, and that empowers change.
Thank you.
Thanks.